Well, good day everybody. This is Joe. Welcome back to the channel. Well, let's see. Last week, I think it was, I did some experiments with the reversal processing of paper negatives into one-of-a-kind positive prints. And this is a project that I started doing about over a year ago. This process, unlike the traditional reversal process that uses chromium-based chemicals for the bleaching, this one uses citric acid and hydrogen peroxide as the bleaching agent. I have had some struggles with it early on last year, and after I did my initial round of experiments, I might have posted a video or so and certainly a few blog articles. I let the process sit untouched. My bottle of 35% hydrogen peroxide has been sitting in the darkroom for over a year, and last week I went out there to just experiment with it and see, are the chemicals still good, first of all? And I was able to get 3 decent pictures, and this one down here that looks real cloudy was overexposed and getting toward the end of daylight, and so I had good results. The reversal process still works. There's a few artifacts going on, like for instance, these pictures have scratches on them. Maybe one of my darkroom tongs that I used to pull the prints out of the chemistry might have been scratching them. It's also possible that the emulsion becomes extra delicate during the process, maybe because of the peroxide bleaching agent or whatever. But anyways, I did have some good results, and I did some typewritten notes on the back here for my own benefit. So it's getting late in the day. It's actually about 7:25 in the evening on Sunday evening here, and so I'm not really going to have the light to go outside and shoot test subjects. So what I thought I would do as a fun thing is let's do some artificial lighting. So my lighting setup here in my studio, I have 4 LED light bulbs that are roughly daylight balanced, and I'm going to use those as a light source, and I'm going to use a still life subject. I think I'm going to use this Polaroid Model 800 camera as my test subject. And the nice thing about a still life subject is nothing moves, and so if I need to use multi-seconds long exposures, I can. So a brief overview of this reversal process for you guys that are unfamiliar with it. The first step is you expose a piece of a negative photo paper, basically print paper, and I would normally rate this paper, which I'm using grade 2 RC paper, the Freestyle Photos Arista brand. I think I'm going to use the semi-matte or luster finish paper. I normally rate that about an ISO of 12 if I was going to use it as a paper negative, but the speed that you need to rate it at is much slower than that. You need to expose much more than that for this process. It becomes a lot more like wet plate collodion in terms of speed. So my little light meter I'm using only goes down to ISO 3. So I did ISO 3 plus 4 stops, 3 stops, and 2 stops. And it turned out that the 3 stops beyond ISO 3 was about optimal for daylight exposure. And so I don't know if these lights are going to give me the same exact response because their spectral emission may be different than daylight, but we'll see. So I'm going to start with that. So you expose the paper in the camera, so you're basically grossly overexposing it, and then you develop it. And in the developer, it's going to turn almost black. It's going to look way overexposed as a negative. And you want to fully develop it, like 2 minutes, let's say, in fresh developer. And then I do a quick rinse just to rinse off developer. And then I have a solution of citric acid, and I was mixing mine last week, like 3 teaspoons into half a liter of water. About 30 seconds in the citric acid. Then I was doing a minute or so in the peroxide solution. And at this point, when it hits the peroxide, in just a matter of 10 or 15 seconds, the print bleaches out to almost pure white. It looks like white paper with some gray spots. Then you go back to the citric acid for another 30 seconds or so, back to the peroxide for another minute or so. You want to do at least 2 rounds of this. And then from there, I take it out with tongs, I rinse it briefly in water just to make it safe to handle so you don't get that high intensity peroxide on your fingers. Then you're going to flash the paper with white light to expose all the remaining silver halides in there. So at the end of this bleaching process, all of the exposed and developed silver oxide has been bleached out of the paper, and all you have left is a latent invisible image of unexposed silver halides. You expose those under bright light and then you develop them again in the developer and fully develop it, and it becomes a positive image. At that point, I don't think there's any silver left, any silver halides left in the paper, and so I might want to fix it just to be safe, but I don't really think it needs fixing. There's not much silver left, so essentially from there you can rinse it and you're done. It's actually fairly simple. Well, okay, let's get the camera. So this is the Intrepid 4x5 camera, and it has a little protective plastic sheet that protects the view screen, the ground glass view screen. And just I'm going to unfurl it here. And then there is a little locking nut that you take off, and there are 3 different positions on the baseboard that you can position the front standard based on the focal length of your lens and or how close you're focusing to the subject. So I'm going to try this initially. Now keep in mind with a view camera, you can stretch it out. I'm using a 135 millimeter Fujinon lens, and so to get close focus, you want to stretch that bellows out a lot further than 135 millimeters because it's not infinity focus, right? It's going to be close focus. Okay, the Fujinon lens, and get it put in here like that. There we go. I have my little shutter release cable. And it's always a good idea to make notes when you're doing this. This is all highly experimental. So I have a little Rhodia pad in a Right in the Rain waterproof holster, and that's my basic note-taking apparatus, right, for all my photo experiments. And since I'm going to be going to and from the darkroom, I only need 1 film holder, so I'm using this Right Way film holder. So at this point, I'm going to get my tripod set up roughly where you're looking at from, maybe off to the side a little bit. Set up this subject matter here, get it framed up, and go out to the darkroom and pour up some chemicals. Okay, so this is the setup. I'm going to be using my little dual 3-drawer tray stack, and I normally have developer, stop, bath, fixer here, rinse, 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 and I would normally go developer, rinse, stop, rinse, fix, and a final holding bath for the chemicals. But since I'm going to be doing a different process, I'm going to be doing developer, rinse, citric acid, peroxide, and then fixer if I need it, and then a final rinse. So I'm going to go pour those chemicals up now. All right, the chemicals are poured up. I'm using gloves when I'm pouring up the peroxide in case I spill something. I try to be really neat with that. So now I'm going to take my semi-matte grade 2 Arista paper and cut a couple sheets and load them up in the film holder, and then we'll figure out our exposure time and do an exposure and a test development and see what happens. Well, okay, here is my Sekonic L308SU. I have it set for ISO 3. I'm going to do an incident exposure, so the incident dome is over the sensor. I'm going to place it in front of the camera and aim the sensor dome back to the lens of my view camera. Take a meter reading. So at f5.6, it's going to be about 4 seconds at ISO 3, and I want to go 3 stops beyond it. 1, 2, 3, and that says 30-second exposure. So 30-second exposure at f5.6. I'm going to use that as my starting exposure. Okay, so the lens has to be set to the bulb setting, and I'm going to cock the shutter and test it. Okay, cock the shutter for reals. Now this Intrepid camera has a rotating film back, so I have the film back situated vertically so I can get the image the way I want it. Pull the dark slide, and I'm going to reference my watch here and do a 30-second exposure. Here we go. Wait on it. All right. And flip around the dark slide so I know that side has been exposed. All right, let's go process it and see what we get. Well, as I said earlier, I have not done indoor still lifes under artificial lighting with this reversal process, but I have done it with the same paper as a paper negative, and I found the film speed compared to daylight under these artificial LED daylight balance lamps to be pretty equivalent. Not much of a speed loss, but that is with a standard negative processing. I don't know if the reversal process will be different. We'll find out. So my little darkroom light is a single red bulb, and it's not bright enough for you to get really illumination to see while I'm doing this in the developing steps that are light sensitive. So I will turn the camera back on when we get to the point that I'm going to do the flashing exposure of light, and the subsequent development in the second developer, you'll be able to see it under white lights. Okay, here we go. Oh yeah, before we get started, my tongs, I have 4 sets of tongs, and this was the tong that might have been the culprit for causing the scratches, because it's missing the rubber tips. So we'll try to not use that one. All right, here we go. Okay, so I have the bleached print in a bath of water, and I'm going to take it out here. This is going to be a tricky situation, so I have to hold the camera. I'm going to expose this print 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005, and put it back into the developer. And now you'll be able to watch the developing happen, the second developer. Now, one of the things I did is when I had it in the peroxide bath, I did it upside down, face down, because I noticed there's a lot of dissolved silver that comes off, and I suspect it clouds the emulsion. It blocks any further bleaching action. So I did it face down so that those little molecules can deposit off the paper instead. So I want to go here a good 2 minutes and develop it to completion. But right now, it actually looks okay. I think my developing is completed. I'm going to do a brief rinse into the same rinsing tray up here that I did right after the first developing. And then I'm going to put it in the fixer tray, just in case there's any residual silver halides, which I don't think there will be, but just in case. I haven't really characterized this process enough to know whether there's any residual silver, unexposed silver, and probably the test for that is to stick it in some bright light for a while and develop it again and see if it turns darker. So there it is in the fixer. Fixing it, I'm probably only going to fix it for 30 seconds. One of the things about fixer, of course this is RC paper, not so bad, but with fiber-based paper, the sodium thiosulfate in the fixer will get into the fibers of the paper, and that will degrade the paper over time. So one of the reasons why you need a good rinse after fixing is to get the sodium thiosulfate fixer out of the fibers. Another reason why not to fix too much if you don't have to. Well, I can tell you right now that I do not have any scratches, and that's good. And my highlights are a lot more neutral in tone. I don't have that funky brown coffee colored stain to the highlights that I was getting last week. And by the way, I'm using the same chemistry from a week ago. And yeah, this looks quite neutral, quite nice. One of the things I like about using this GoPro camera is I don't have to worry about liquid getting on it, at least from a wetness perspective. Don't want chemistry on it, but liquid in general is not too bad. Okay, so now I'm going to do a little hair dryer. Dry off the squeegee blade. The edge of the print I always make sure overhangs the cutting board so I can flip it over. When I squeegee at the front side, I pull it away from the squeegee so I don't get this bead of water underneath the print and re-wetting the back side, as it is wont to do on occasion. Okay, there it is. So if you do want to use a hairdryer to dry your prints, it's especially handy for RC paper because you can get it pretty much completely dry in just a minute or so. If you do that, make sure you use a dedicated hairdryer that nobody uses for actual drying hair, because otherwise you get little particles of hairspray and dandruff and, you know, hair goop and scalp goop or whatever gets clogged up into a hairdryer. You don't want that on your pictures, so dedicated, cheap little hairdryer. Anyways, well, let's go look at this in the office, shall we? Let's see, I have these little glassine envelopes. These are like a paper, almost like wax paper, kind of. These are old school. You know, I gotta say this. You know you're old school if, when you grew up, they never used the phrase old school. Okay, that's how you define old school. Anyways, so first of all, I don't have any scratches at all, so obviously those tongs were a problem. And secondly, you couldn't see it because it was too dark and I didn't film it, but when I put it in the bleach, the first round of bleaching, I could see this white, milky precipitate floating up off the print as the silver was bleached out, dissolving. And it struck me, and I've been thinking about this for a while, because these other pictures, I don't know if you can see these, but these other pictures had this kind of, the highlights had this kind of brownish stain on them. And if I look at the two, it's definitely more neutral here with this one. So I anyway flipped it around as soon as it started to bleach, and I flipped it around and just agitated it in the tray of peroxide for the remaining minute, and then went back a second round, 30 seconds in the citric acid, another minute face down in the bleach, the peroxide. And this came out really nice, actually, really nice. And I like the convenience of RC paper, but I like this semi-matte finish for prints. And so that's pretty cool. Yeah, 30 seconds under these lights. So I might increase my f-stop, one stop, and then double the exposure time and get a little bit wider depth of focus on this, because I do have another piece of paper that I cut and mounted on the other side of that double-sided film holder. Oh, and before we do a second print, let's talk about the tones on this picture. So it's a light gray, beige, brown, tan, silver, light gray kind of camera. And so the tones are very light on the camera, but they're not totally blown out. I think there's some detail in there. So I think this rough estimation of ISO 3 plus 3 stops more exposure seems to be pretty good for this paper, using either daylight or these daylight balanced LED bulbs. So one of the cool things about using still life under artificial lighting is the lighting doesn't change, so I really don't have to re-meter it. I already know what the meter reading is, so it makes it nice and quick for doing repetitive shots. Okay, film holder's in place, verifying that my shutter is closed, and I have my trusty analog quartz solar powered Casio plastic dive watch. Here we go with a minute exposure, waiting for the top of the minute. Okay, a minute exposure. All right, the minute is up. Put the dark slide back in. Take the film holder out. Back to the darkroom we go. Well, okay, so it is in the second rinse bath after the peroxide. And I'm going to set the camera down here. And now, ready. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. Into the developer again. 722 on the timer. Let's look at it. So we'll go to 930. So the idea here is we're just trying to develop out all the remaining silver halides. We'll go to 9:20 or 9:30, I guess, on the timer. And it looks from here that the exposure is pretty close to the other one. So the extrapolation of one stop less light equates to one stop doubling the exposure time from 30 seconds to a minute. That linearity seems to hold true. So, as is my experience with using print paper as actual print paper, you can go multi-seconds long exposures, and the linearity, if you want to call it lack of reciprocity failure, still holds with this paper. Now, maybe if you used a pinhole camera with a tiny aperture and went out 30 minutes to an hour, maybe there's some reciprocity failure, but I've never really seen reciprocity failure with photo paper, even out to about 10 minutes exposure time. It seems to hold right to what the meter suggests. So this second print I did not fix. Just went from the second developer to the rinse. And this will be a test over time to see how these two prints fare. But I suspect there's not much unexposed silver halides left in the picture at all. And actually, any silver halides that are in here should represent the shadows anyways, since it's a reversal type of process. So I wouldn't expect the highlights to fade. Maybe the shadows might get a little denser. Well, okay, so I like the results from these two exposures. Looking at the highlights of both of them, they look very similar, and there is a difference in tone between the background curtain behind me, probably because I shifted the position of the camera up there slightly, the view camera, and on the second picture I did get it a little bit too far off center to the left. The camera should have been a little more centered, but of course I did include the first picture in the second picture, and the tones look very similar between the camera itself and the picture of the camera from the first print, which is kind of cool. And yeah, I do have definitely more depth of focus in the second picture, so that was a good strategy of increasing my focal ratio up to f8 approximately. Now if you compare these two pictures from this session today with one I did last week using the same chemistry, fresher chemistry, I have some kind of orange colored stains on parts of this in the highlights on this from last week. The tones of the highlights are a little bit more coffee colored, not quite as light as they are in these new ones here. I think I can attribute most of the difference to the fact that I processed them in the peroxide solution face down. So when I first saw that white precipitate coming off the picture when I was first bleaching the first print, I realized what was happening, and that was probably the reason why I was getting these murky, blotchy kind of results. And also, I had similar kinds of issues about a year ago when I first tried this process. So I think I have a new finding. Process it in the peroxide face down, and of course I did it in the citric acid also face down. The tones are pretty neutral on this. I like it. Kind of a warm tone, but not exceptionally so. So really cool. I like the RC paper. Very convenient to process, dries quickly, and I can see the potential for doing this kind of photography out in public, kind of like the Afghan box cameras and what is done a lot in some of the South American countries, Argentina, places like that, camera miniaturas, as they call them. Instead of using a negative process where you have to rephotograph the paper negative to make a positive, you could do it as a one-step process. It would take approximately 10 minutes, the way I do this, a little bit less than 10 minutes, to get a finished picture, which is not bad, actually, pretty quick. And I think it lends itself to the process because if you can live without having to use fixer, that means you don't need nearly as long of a rinse time. Really, you're just going to rinse off the residual chemical real quick off the surface of the RC paper, and there you go. So if you are interested in doing some kind of experimental photography like this, my suggestion is doing it indoors, especially doing it at night where you don't have daylight coming in through a window that might confuse your results, mixing the daylight with artificial lights. Do it in the evening under strictly artificial lights. These LED lights put out an equivalent of 100 watts of incandescent light, but they're cool running. It's a really convenient way to do this kind of controlled testing. The lighting is very controlled and doesn't change. You have a fixed setup. The focus doesn't change. I have my view camera set up here. It doesn't move. And it's really quick to get data turns, to do multiple cycles of the process and do some quick learning. I think I learned more about the process here in just this brief time I've done this video than I did all last week when I was doing it in and out outside to the backyard and doing an outdoor setting. So I really like this. And also, if you are a fan of still life photography or portraiture, using indoor lighting like this is not bad. It's pretty convenient. I did not develop this process or invent this process on my own. I first heard about it on Photrio, which used to be called APUG, Analog Photography Users Group. Someone else had developed the process, and I just played with it. There's another photographer here in Albuquerque who's also working with the process as well. So Ethan, his name is, and so I might in the future interview him. And I'll actually drop a link down below to Ethan's video. He's done a video on this process himself. And what Ethan has done is he has made a 3D printed plastic pinhole camera where with an internal shutter where you can close the shutter, unscrew the pinhole aperture with a bayonet mount, and then attach a light type pour spout in place of it, and then he can use the camera as a developing tank. Ooh, isn't that a cool idea? So that's what Ethan's been doing with 3D printing. I'm going to have to do an interview of him one of these days. But anyways, this is Joe Van Cleve, and I hope you liked this. Drop any notes or comments, questions down below. Thank you very much for watching. Stay creative and have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye.